All right, so we're COMP 1050 Animation 2D Tools, and it's week 5, part 2. And we're talking about Actionscript and game programming. I love that sound. So what I want to go over today is some basics. We're going to talk about Actionscript game programming strategies, right? Good programming practices. We're going to kind of skip over them again just to remind you guys of what I'm expecting from a good programming practice perspective, right? So I think it's important for us to do that. Sometimes I think we forget, you know, what's the thing to do. Let's talk about, you know, Actionscript 3. Really what we're going to be doing is Actionscript 3 is a very versatile language. It reminds me a lot of the old days of scripting when we were doing things with C++. It's a very basic language, but it's a very powerful language. It's object-oriented, which is amazing, right, for us. And you know what? If you've already done Python, I'm telling you like this. My challenge to you, remember last week I challenged you to build a tank? Who did the tank last week? I said, build a simple movement, some kind of thing movement, make it move around the screen. And it was a precursor to this week because I was going to give you your assignment. So who's actually done any of that work? I bet you no one has, because you guys are so busy. Anyways, if you haven't had a chance to do it, right, busy the way you guys are, right, my recommendation is you get to it. You start doing it, because if you don't do it, it's going to sneak up on you. It's one of these things that it takes hours of like Python did, it takes a lot of development time, more than web programming, much more. Okay. So what we're going to do is, for now, we're going to use the single class method when we build our games, okay? There's many ways we can do this. One way is we can use the multiple class method, right? Like sometimes what you might have in some cases is almost like this, you know, you might have other game books that talk about using different classes for different characters. Like for example, I have an enemy, I use an enemy class. I have a bullet, I use a bullet class, and I have them in different files. If you want to go there, that's good. And I talked to you last week about what if you want to use things like, you know, things like Flash Builder, right? And you don't want to use the Flash development environment itself. That's okay. Or if you want to use Flash Develop, a PC compatible, you know, kind of environment as well. That's okay. You choose your development environment. As long as I get the relevant files at the end, I'm good. Right? You have to be comfortable coding. But for now, we're going to start off, and this is how we're going to start, before we get into Starling, with this single class method. So one class is going to house it all, kind of thing, for most of your most of the stuff that you're going to be using. Okay. I also want you to think about things when you build this game. I've just given you this assignment. And what I want you to think about is use this smallest step approach, right, when you start breaking at your game. So, example, I've given you this, hey, move your player in 8 directions. Well, what if it was like rotating a spaceship? If you break it down into small pieces, it would be things like, okay, well, let's check to see whether the left arrow is pressed. That's a smaller task, right? Okay, let's subtract from the rotation property of the spaceship sprite. Okay, we're going to talk about sprites today, okay? Let's check to see whether the right arrow is pressed. Okay, let's check. Okay, and what about the rotation? Let's change the, add to the rotation property of the spaceship if the right arrow is pressed, right? So you can break your, like we talked about before, you can break your programming into smaller tasks to make it so that it's more something that you can eat. Think about it this way. A game is like a much bigger project. We just talked about earlier today, we talked about analysis and design. Software analysis and design, and the software development lifecycle, right? We talked about way back when you were working with Jared, right? And you know, there's all these different parts of it. Part of it is the planning phase. I really recommend to you to plan what the hell you're going to do. All right? I've ranted this morning, right, when we were talking on advanced web programming about planning. If you don't do planning when you're doing this game, you'll be buried, right? You will not be able to finish on time. There's just so many little tasks to do. So my recommendation to you is sit down and think about what your game is going to look like. Do a little sketch for yourself, right? And start breaking it down into this smallest step approach and say, okay, here's all the steps I got to take. I got to talk about movement, character movement. How do I do it? are my obstacles going to move? And my recommendation to you right now, when you start off, to make it simple for yourself, because you're just learning how to use Actionscript, right? Even though you know how to use Python and you've done other languages before, there are some quirks to making this stuff work in Actionscript and in Flash, which will slow you down. There'll be some development quirks that you're going to be running into, right? So start slow. Plan what you're going to be doing with your game, and then slowly build into it. So break it down into this, the big tasks into much smaller tasks. Like if you don't know how to do something, a lot of times you can get it done by breaking them down, breaking the task down. Like fog of war. What is a fog of war anyway, right? I've asked you to do a fog of war. Well, all it is just something that's going to prevent you as the player from seeing the entire screen, right? The most simplest approach would be the entire screen is black and you can't see because it's got a layer of blackness around it, and the only thing that's visible is around your player, like I showed you in the last time. So we'll talk about how to do that, how to do fog of war in Actionscript, right? So it's not like you're going to be all on your own, but you're going to have to assimilate all this information, right, and put it all together and make it all work for your game. So the simple way I would do it is, hey, let's not do a fog of war in the beginning, right? That's what you might think. But maybe what you want to think about is, maybe I should start with a fog of war, right? So that way I don't have to redo my work later, right? So a little bit of planning is some of the stuff that you want to get into. Okay. Let's talk about good programming practices. So these are kind of guidelines, but I think it's important. It's some of the stuff we've hit before in other classes. Make sure you comment. I mean, I don't know how many times I kind of rant and rave, and actually you're getting marks based on your internal documentation. And I think a lot of this, sometimes you don't do enough of it, right? I mean, you as programmers, I think we all don't do enough internal comments, line comments and block comments. Block comments, really, it's around a function or a section of code that you want it to do something. Like, for example, if there's a section of code that defines the way your player moves, you should comment it. You should do a block comment and say, here's my movement section, right, kind of thing. And then there should be another comment for your header, like I talked about before, who you are as a programmer, the version that you're doing for yourself, what's the version number, and so on. Okay. Version control will be in there. It just won't be GitHub. I won't force you to use GitHub this time around. Okay. Use descriptive variables and function names. Again, this is like kind of the code commenting itself. Okay, that's really, really important. So if you don't use descriptive variables and function names, a lot of times what we get into is, I see a C, and C doesn't mean anything to me. A C, an I, a J, a K, an X. Unless you're using X's and Y's, and by the way, I recommend you don't use X and Y's at all, because X and Y's in Actionscript mean position, right? Which might screw you up. So please try and avoid using X and Y's and Z's. Turn repetitive or smaller code into functions. Who would have thought, right? You got a lot of little repetitious code, and you decide for yourself that you want to turn it into function. How do you do that? Well, here's an example. If I have this thing called, if I have a score display text field, and I want to show the player's score, and I keep doing it over and over again, I better turn it into a function that I can call, as opposed to putting the same line of code over and over and over again. If you see a lot of that, turn it into a function. All right. I like this one too. And it kind of goes back to the smaller step approach, which is test your code in small pieces. So don't just sit there and write, and keep writing your code, and all of a sudden you try and run it, and you're like, why doesn't this work? How come it doesn't work? Well, because you just wrote a bunch of code, and you're trying to test all of it, right? Try and test it in blocks and pieces. And sometimes what you need to do is make a little experiment, like I talked to you guys before in other classes. So let's say you haven't done this before. You haven't done a fog of war, and you want to figure out how to do a fog of war. You do a fog of war experiment. You figure out fog of war, and then you incorporate that into your game. How to do fog of war when the person's walking, or analyze the code that comes with, Flash CS6, the development environment, and see what they've done. How did they do the the fog of war? And by the way, I've given you that code. I'm allowing you to take it and analyze it and use it. And you're not going to get docked for using it. So if you use their idea of how to do it, that's okay. So you kind of have a starting point anyway, right? So let's say, for example, here's an example. If you wanted to make a loop that places 10 circles on the screen at random locations with random colors. So here's step 1, create the 10 circles at random locations, right? Okay. Step 2, test your code and get the portion working just like you want, like 10 random locations, right? And then number 3, add the random color functionality. I think you can even break this down even further, right? Figure out how to do random numbers. That'd be the first thing. How do I do random numbers in Actionscript anyway, right? Using the math.random function. And basically it's like this. Break your program task into small steps, create the code for each step, and then test each step. So don't move to the next step unless you've tested the previous one. Okay? Let's talk about some basic Actionscript concepts. So we've talked to Actionscript all this time, right? So remember, Actionscript kind of looks like ECMAScript or JavaScript, but it's not JavaScript. It's Actionscript, all right? So again, here's some examples of some variables, right? You can do like this. var my value is equal to 3, right? Well, my value is equal to 3. I haven't assigned a data type to this at all, right? It's a generic variable. Is it good to use generic variables when we program, right? The answer is probably not, unless you really have no choice, right? Or you're testing something out, you don't know what data type you want to make it. You could do this, by the way. You could make it so that my value is equal to 3 is a generic variable that has not a data type at all in Actionscript. But I recommend you do it this way. var my value colon int is equal to 7, as an example. It's better that way. So we know it's an integer value, right? Same thing for my value colon number is equal to 7.8. Number is a decimal or floating point number, right? So I'd rather have you typecast your variables ahead of time into specific data types as opposed to giving it a generic value. All right, here's another one. There's also string and Boolean types, right? Strings hold text. That's just like normal programming languages. And Booleans are either true or false. And these are all the basic primitive types, if you will, of variables that you can use. Okay? Right now, you don't have to mention that they're private or public. But when we start using classes, you're going to have to mention whether they're private or public. And you know what? If there's a convention out there for Actionscript 3, they use the underscore character before the variable name to indicate a variable that is private. Okay, so you might see that around there in your documentation. So you have an underscore and whatever my variable is, right? And that means it's a private variable only accessible to the class members. Okay, that's kind of a convention that's out there. Here's some other ones, some arithmetic operations, kind of the same we've seen in other languages, right? My number is equal to 7.8 plus 2, right? That's a valid arithmetic operation. You have the plus, the minus, the star for multiplication, and the slash for division, right? These are all the same things we've seen in other languages. Same thing with this incrementer and decrementer operator, the plus plus and the minus minus operator. They exist there for us as well. Just to remind you, plus equals, minus equals, all these things are there because it's a C-style language. Order of operations also works out the same way we see in other languages. Okay. You can also add strings together, concatenate strings. One string plus the other string equal a combination of string. You can also do a plus equals with strings as well, not just with numeric values. Conditional statements, really quickly, if you look up here, they all look the same. If and else if and else. And I recommend also that you look at the switch statement, because the switch statement also exists. I haven't detailed it here, but it also exists in Actionscript. In fact, if anything, if you look at Flash, I'm just going to go there for a second, and if I go back to that little example program that we were looking at, more, sample files, and I look at the RPG game collisions program, and open it up, And if I go to my Actionscript file, and if I look down here, look, I've got this switch statement that you're going to see that is actually really good for keyboard up and keyboard down commands, right? So this is kind of really, really good. It works fine, right? And it kind of gives you this, you know, kind of a template for how to move around with your character, right, using the switch statement, which works exactly like it does in many other languages. Okay. So we got your conditional statements. Loops, pretty much the same as anywhere else. Again, just as a review, for loop. You know, here we're doing for var, the index, where it's an integer, which is equal to 0, index is less than 10, index plus plus. It's the exact same thing that we've seen in any other C-style language. Same thing with the while loop, and there's even the do loop. So we've got a do while loop as well if we really need to get to that structure. But it's more rare for us as it's not something that we always use unless we want something to run once at least. Functions. Here's the syntax for functions. We've seen them before. The full syntax is the accessor keyword, private, public, whatever. Function, that keyword function. My function, whatever the function name is. Any variables or arguments that pass to the function. And then colon, and you're going to see a return value for the function. Does the return value always have to be there? The answer is no. The default is void anyway. So if it's void, you don't have to include it, but I recommend that you do. I recommend that you get into the habit of putting colon void at the end of any function that doesn't return a value. All right? And you don't have to use the private or public keyword unless you're using classes, which we'll go into today. We'll see how you don't need to use that. Testing and debugging. Again, we write code, we test the code, we debug the code. Well, Flash, the development environment, has a debugger built in. There's different kinds of bugs. For example, one, you get an error message when it compiles or runs, a compile time error, right? In this case, you kind of have to figure out the problem, correct it, and then you compile it again, right? Usually you can see that it's a syntax error that's stopping you from doing things, right? Two, the program does not work as expected. It works, but something's not really functioning like the way you like, right? That's a different kind of error, right? So you need to kind of hunt this one down, right, to figure out what it is. Three, you know, you're not debugging because there's an error. You're debugging because you want your code, you want to improve your code. Sometimes it's efficiency. Sometimes it's too slow, or it doesn't work like you like, right? And you want to speed things up. So you debug it so you can improve it. Or maybe you've changed it. Maybe you've added some, you've changed some redundant code into functions, and now you want to test it again to make sure that changes you made, now that it's a function, is working the same way as it was before when it was all over your, when the same line of code was all over the place. So here's some method of testing. You can track down issues with your code in several ways. You can, when the code is too long or the calculations are too difficult, sometimes a trace command, and I think trace is going to be your best friend. Trace is like your console.out or your console.log command, right? That's what it is. So use trace as much as you can to figure out the problem if you can't hunt it down yourself, right? Sometimes you're going to be able to think about it in your head, and you're going to be able to go through things line by line. You go through it and you go, okay, I should have the result should be 5. Right, whatever the calculation that you're making happen, right? But if you can't do it, and if it's too long, trace is a really good tool. You can also use the built-in debugger, right? You can kind of put you can toggle a breakpoint, set a breakpoint in your Flash debugger. Let me show you how that works. So here I am back in Flash. There's my game, right? And I go into my code here, and now I want to put a breakpoint. I can put it right here, right? By going to the border here, this gutter, and clicking onto it, just like we've seen in other languages. And then you can use debug mode. For example, right now we always kind of go into, when we test the movie in Flash Player, but we can also test the movie and we can debug the movie, which is a totally different thing. I can debug the movie, and if I go to debug mode, it's going to take me to a different mode, right? An example of this would be Now my perspective has changed, just like it does in other development environments. And I can see debugging information, right here we are right here, as opposed to just the testing the movie in Flash like we normally do. Okay. Okay, publishing your game. This is a pretty big one too. There's some options for you to publish your game. Right now, we're going to be either doing it in Flash or HTML. But when we hit Starling, we're going to start doing things for mobile, right? You can actually publish the same script that you're using today with Starling, and it can be done for the mobile platform as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. Some formats, basically, when you look at your publishing, your defaults are pretty good as they stand, right? The only thing is when we move into, again, more complicated stuff with Starling and so on, we're going to be adding additional pages. For example, we're going to go into classes, and classes are external files that we're going to be using. Right now, everything is embedded in the Flash development environment, in your Flash movie, your FLA file. Your Flash settings all should be targeting something like Flash Player 11.2 or 11.4. There's also a couple of options for you to switch to direct or GPU acceleration. And you won't notice the effects of this unless you actually test it in your HTML document. So you have an HTML document or a standalone Flash player, you won't notice the acceleration unless you test it there. If you try and test the acceleration by running, hitting Command Enter or Control Enter, you won't notice the acceleration. It actually turns it off, right? So you have to kind of see it from that perspective. Remember, what it does is Flash will try to use the GPU to accelerate the performance. Take care, Kenny. And I'm just going to skip forward in this one because we've kind of talked about this a lot. So basically, there's different options for when we publish our movie, and we're going to get more into them. I've kind of put together the most basic options, and really what I'm asking you to do at this point is stick to the defaults, right? And you're going to be okay.